In 1942, as the fires of World War II raged across Europe and the Pacific, a statement from the United States sent ripples through the Axis Command. President Franklin D. Roosevelt had boldly declared that America would build 50,000 military aircraft in a single year, a number so staggering that even seasoned military men gasped in disbelief. In Berlin, the reaction was instant and mocking. Reichsmarshal Hermann Göring, the flamboyant and arrogant head of the Luftwaffe, reportedly burst into laughter when he heard the news. To him, the claim was not ambition, it was comedy. Göring, who prided himself on commanding the most advanced air force in the world, scoffed at the idea that a nation of factory workers and farmers could ever match German engineering and discipline. 50,000 planes? He sneered during a briefing. The Americans will drown in oil before they build half that number. His officers chuckled, confident that the Luftwaffe would continue to dominate the skies of Europe. But Göring's laughter would not age well. What he failed to grasp, what no Axis leader truly understood, was that America's greatest weapon was not its military might, but its industrial willpower. When the nation committed to a goal, it didn't merely chase it, it redefined the possible. From Detroit's automobile assembly lines to Boeing's aircraft plants in Seattle, the United States transformed overnight into a war machine of unimaginable scale. Automobile factories switched to producing bombers, kitchen appliance manufacturers began building aircraft engines, and ordinary men and women, from teenagers to grandmothers, filled the workshops that never slept. While Göring's Luftwaffe was already showing signs of strain, overextended, undersupplied, and losing experienced pilots faster than it could replace them, American production surged like a tidal wave. By the end of 1943, the mockery had turned to panic. The Allies weren't just meeting Roosevelt's goal, they were shattering it. Factories rolled out fighter planes, bombers, transports, and reconnaissance aircraft in such staggering numbers that storage fields across the U.S. overflowed with freshly painted machines waiting to be ferried overseas. By the war's end, America had built over 100,000 aircraft in a single year, more than the Luftwaffe produced during the entire conflict. Göring, once the master of the skies, now presided over a shattered air force, grounded and gasping beneath Allied air supremacy. The same man who laughed at the audacity of the American promise would later mutter in defeat that Germany had lost the air war before we lost the land. The story of that laughter and its ultimate humiliation is not just about numbers or machines, it's about belief. It's the story of how an industrial democracy, underestimated and mocked, turned factories into front lines and workers into warriors. It's the story of how arrogance met determination and lost. Hermann Göring's laughter may have echoed across Berlin in 1942, but by 1945, it was drowned out by a far greater sound, the relentless roar of 100,000 American engines thundering across the skies. In the grand marble halls of the Reich Air Ministry, the air was thick with smoke, arrogance, and misplaced confidence. It was early 1942, and Hermann Göring, the self-proclaimed master of the Luftwaffe, sat beneath an enormous chandelier, his jeweled baton resting casually across his lap. Around him, generals and air marshals gathered for one of his many strategic briefings, sessions that were as much about ego as they were about war. When word reached Berlin that President Franklin D. Roosevelt had publicly announced America's goal of producing 50,000 aircraft per year, the room erupted not in alarm, but in laughter. Göring himself roared the loudest, his booming voice echoing through the marble corridors. 50,000 planes? Americans can't even build 50,000 bicycles without collapsing, he sneered, waving a cigar for emphasis. To him, the idea was absurd, an empty boast from a country that, in his mind, lacked the discipline, the efficiency, and the military soul of Germany. He imagined American factories filled with lazy workers and engineers who had never heard a bomb fall. The Luftwaffe, at that time, was a fearsome force, dominating European skies. The Blitz over London had proven its might, and Göring basked in the illusion of eternal supremacy. Yet beneath the laughter, cracks were already forming. The Battle of Britain had drained the Luftwaffe's finest pilots, and the Russian front was swallowing men and machines faster than Germany could replace them. But arrogance is the enemy of foresight, and Göring's pride would blind him to the industrial hurricane rising across the Atlantic. Meanwhile, in Washington, D.C., Roosevelt's announcement was no mere propaganda. It was a challenge, a declaration that America would become the arsenal of democracy. Even as Göring mocked the plan, Detroit's automobile plants were being transformed overnight into aircraft assembly lines. Men and women who once built Buicks and Fords were learning to rivet wings and weld fuselages. Ford's Willow Run plant, still just a skeleton of steel beams, was designed to roll out one B-24 Liberator bomber every hour. Göring's laughter, if it could have reached across the ocean, would have been drowned out by the sound of hammers, engines, and dreams taking flight. Back in Berlin, Göring puffed his chest and bragged to Hitler that the Luftwaffe would crush any American force before it even reached the skies of Europe. Hitler nodded, his mind already consumed by visions of new offensives in the East. They both underestimated not just American industry, but American will. For while Germany perfected destruction, the United States perfected production. Factories would soon hum 24 hours a day, lit by sparks and patriotism. Women, known as Rosie the Riveters, replaced men who had gone to war, proving that strength was not limited to the battlefield. Every riveted panel, every polished propeller was a silent response to Göring's laughter. And as the first thousands of planes rolled out, shiny, powerful, and unstoppable, the world began to understand that Roosevelt's promise wasn't madness, but manifest destiny in metal and motion. The winter of 1942 was bitter across Europe, but in America, the fire of industry burned hotter than ever before. The thunder of machines echoed day and night, shaking the ground of once quiet towns now transformed into industrial fortresses. The smell of oil, metal, and sweat filled the air as thousands of men and women worked shoulder to shoulder, forging the wings of war. Every screw tightened, every rivet hammered, every spark that flew from a welder's torch brought Roosevelt's promise closer to reality. The skies outside the factory windows glowed orange with the light of molten steel. The hum of progress never stopped. The United States, once mocked as soft and lazy, had become an unstoppable war engine. At Willow Run, the heart of America's aircraft revolution, engineers no longer measured progress in weeks or months, but in minutes. Every 63 minutes, a fully armed B-24 Liberator rolled out of the assembly line, ready for the front. It was a machine of terrifying beauty, its 4 roaring engines capable of carrying 5 tons of bombs over vast distances. The bomber's name said it all: Liberator. For those who built it, it symbolized freedom, vengeance, and power. For Göring and his Luftwaffe, it would soon become a nightmare. The statistics began to shock even Roosevelt's planners. By the end of 1942, American factories had produced over 48,000 aircraft, nearly reaching the 50,000 target in less than a year. No empire in history had ever achieved industrial output on such a scale. From Boeing's hangars in Seattle to Douglas's plants in California, from Curtiss in Buffalo to North American Aviation in Inglewood, production lines stretched for miles. The country's railways groaned under the weight of engines, wings, and fuselages being transported to the coasts. It was a symphony of logistics orchestrated with perfect precision. In the Pacific Northwest, Boeing engineers worked sleepless nights refining their masterpiece, the B-17 Flying Fortress. With its 10 machine guns and near-invincible frame, it became a symbol of American strength. Over Europe, squadrons of B-17s would soon darken the skies, escorted by nimble P-51 Mustangs, whose long-range power would destroy Germany's dream of air superiority. Meanwhile, the factories that built these machines had become legends of their own. Workers nicknamed them the Thunder Mills. To walk through one was like stepping into a living organism, metal flowing through its veins, light blazing from every window, energy pulsing through every gear and belt. Workers labored 12-hour shifts, sleeping in makeshift dorms beside their machines. Cafeterias ran around the clock, serving sandwiches, coffee, and determination. Posters hung everywhere, "Keep 'em flying," "Build for victory," "Every plane counts." Even children collected scrap metal, old tires, and kitchen pans, feeding the insatiable hunger of production. America wasn't just fighting the war, it was manufacturing victory. While Göring continued to boast of his Luftwaffe's power, his intelligence officers began to whisper the truth. Reports smuggled from neutral countries described American factories that never slept, of trains moving night and day loaded with parts, of ships leaving New York and Boston carrying endless cargoes of aircraft components. Göring dismissed them all. Lies, he scoffed, American propaganda. But the signs were undeniable. German pilots on the Eastern Front began to encounter new aircraft they had never seen before. The Soviet Union, supplied through the Lend-Lease program, now received American-built planes like the Bell P-39 Airacobra and the Douglas A-20 Havoc. These machines, though not perfect, filled Soviet skies and replaced losses faster than Germany could inflict them. Göring's confidence started to crack. At Luftwaffe headquarters, he raged at his staff, demanding explanations. Where are these aircraft coming from? How can the Americans build so much, so fast? His generals had no answers. Some secretly admired America's industrial miracle, others feared it. They all knew that if production continued at this pace, the Luftwaffe would face an enemy it could not outbuild. In Detroit, Henry Ford watched as his massive factory empire achieved the impossible. Willow Run alone employed over 80,000 people. Women in overalls and goggles assembled gun turrets, welded fuselages, and tested engines. The plant's assembly line was over a mile long. Planes started as scattered metal sheets at one end and emerged as fully operational bombers at the other. It was industrial magic, a human achievement that defied logic. Ford's rivals, General Motors, Chrysler, and Packard, followed suit, each dedicating their plants to the war. The automotive rivalry of the 1930s had transformed into the backbone of America's military power. Even Hollywood joined the war effort, producing propaganda films to inspire workers and soldiers alike. Stars like Clark Gable and James Stewart served as pilots, proving that America's will to fight extended from the screen to the sky. Every citizen became part of the mission. And yet the human cost was immense. Accidents were common, factories caught fire, workers fainted from exhaustion, but none quit. "We're building wings for freedom," one worker said. "We can sleep when Hitler's gone." By mid-1943, the American industrial storm had reached full fury. Over 86,000 planes had rolled out of factories, fighters, bombers, transports, and trainers. Every model had a purpose, every pilot had a machine. The once laughable number of 50,000 now looked small. Roosevelt's planners pushed for more. "Let's make it 125,000 next year," one advisor said. And they meant it. America's economy was no longer measured in dollars, it was measured in horsepower and firepower. Ships carried disassembled aircraft across the Atlantic, where they were reassembled in England. Airfields from Scotland to southern Italy filled with rows of silver wings bearing white stars. The thunder of engines became a daily sound in Europe, a promise and a warning. When Göring's intelligence finally confirmed the truth that America had indeed built over 100,000 planes, he refused to believe it. "Impossible," he hissed. But as the Allies launched their bombing campaigns, the evidence screamed from the skies. In broad daylight, thousands of American bombers crossed into German airspace, blotting out the sun. Anti-aircraft crews stared upward in disbelief. German civilians who had once cheered Göring's boasts now cowered in shelters as Allied bombs rained down. The Reichsmarschall, who had promised Hitler control of the skies, watched helplessly as the sky itself turned against him. The once proud Luftwaffe, starved of fuel and pilots, could not stop the storm. Göring's laughter had died, replaced by silence and fear. America had done the impossible. What began as Roosevelt's dream had become the hammer of history. The factories of thunder had spoken, and their echo would roar across the ruins of the Reich. Wings over Europe. The year was 1943, and the skies over Europe had become the new front lines of the war. Gone were the days when the Luftwaffe ruled unchallenged. Now, from the coasts of England to the borders of Germany, the sound of American engines thundered through the clouds. The once silent skies were filled with silver wings, squadrons of bombers flying in perfect formation, escorted by sleek fighters with the white star and bar insignia that struck both fear and awe. The American Air Armada had arrived, and with it came a new kind of warfare that even Göring's arrogance could not withstand. In every occupied city, civilians would look up and see the sun vanish behind thousands of aircraft, the roar so immense it seemed to shake the heavens themselves. To the German soldiers below, it felt like a steel storm that would never end. From the airfields of England, the 8th Air Force rose daily, launching bombing runs deep into Nazi territory. Their targets were not just military bases, but the lifeblood of the German war machine: factories, oil refineries, rail yards, and ball-bearing plants. Every mission carried risk. Every mile into Germany meant facing anti-aircraft fire and swarms of enemy fighters. But the Americans kept coming. Every day, every week, every month. What Göring once called American toys were now leveling his empire one city at a time. The Luftwaffe fought back fiercely, its pilots courageous but outnumbered. The Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s were deadly machines, and German pilots, veterans of countless battles, used every trick they knew. But for every bomber they shot down, 2 more appeared. American pilots began calling the missions milk runs because the production back home never stopped, a new bomber for every one lost. Göring's officers reported terrifying numbers: 500 bombers lost in a month, yet over 1,000 replacements already crossing the Atlantic. It defied logic. Germany could no longer replace its losses, while America could replace them overnight. The air war became a battle of endurance, and endurance was America's greatest weapon. The British joined the campaign, striking by night as the Americans struck by day. Together, they created what would be called round-the-clock bombing. German cities glowed red at midnight and smoked black by noon. Industrial centers like Hamburg, Cologne, and Essen were reduced to ashes. Hitler raged, demanding that Göring defend the fatherland. Göring promised to stop the bombers, to fill the skies with fire, but his promises fell empty. Factories that once built the proud Luftwaffe now lay in rubble. Fuel became scarce. Pilot training programs collapsed. Young boys barely out of school were being sent into combat against seasoned American and British aces. They were brave, but bravery could not stop the tide of steel and fire above them. Meanwhile, in America, the spirit of unity and sacrifice burned brighter than ever. Every city and town felt part of the mission. Newspapers printed stories of bombing raids, praising the courage of our boys in the sky. At the same time, factories expanded again, increasing production with every new challenge. In Seattle, Boeing rolled out the first B-29 Super Fortress, a machine so advanced it seemed born from the future. Pressurized cabins, remote-controlled guns, and massive bomb loads capable of striking targets over 3,000 miles away. Roosevelt's vision had now transcended numbers. America was not just outproducing the enemy, it was outthinking them. Scientists and engineers worked around the clock to make every design deadlier and more efficient. The cooperation between industry, science, and the military was unlike anything the world had ever seen. German civilians, once confident in Göring's boasts that no enemy bomb shall ever fall on German soil, now lived in darkness. Blackout curtains hung in every window. Air raid sirens wailed nightly, and shelters overflowed with frightened families. Göring's image, once heroic, became a symbol of failure. His flamboyant uniforms and vanity now drew scorn. Hitler's trust in him began to erode. The Führer demanded results, but Göring could only offer excuses. The weather, he said, the fuel shortages, the sabotage. But in truth, it was the sheer, unstoppable weight of American production that crushed him. The U.S. could lose 100 planes and replace them in a day. Germany could not replace one without starving another part of its army. The balance of the skies had shifted forever. As 1944 approached, the Allies prepared for the next great phase, Operation Overlord, the invasion of Western Europe. The air war now became a prelude to liberation. American bombers systematically destroyed rail networks, bridges, and communication lines across France, isolating German divisions from reinforcement. By the time the invasion fleet gathered in the English Channel, the Luftwaffe was almost powerless to respond. Göring, once the master of the skies, could do nothing but watch from Berlin as Allied air power blotted out the horizon. On June 6, 1944, when the Allies stormed the beaches of Normandy, the skies were filled with Allied aircraft from dawn to dusk. German troops looked up in horror. There were no Luftwaffe planes to save them. American P-47 Thunderbolts swooped down, blasting tanks and trucks, while bombers flattened coastal defenses. Göring's promise that the Luftwaffe will protect you became a bitter joke among German soldiers. The Reichsmarschall who once laughed at Roosevelt's dream now faced the nightmare of defeat. The Americans were not only building planes, they were building destiny. Each new aircraft model pushed technology further. The P-51 Mustang became a legend, capable of escorting bombers all the way to Berlin and back. With these long-range escorts, American bombing losses plummeted while German losses soared. Even ace pilots like Adolf Galland and Erich Hartmann, men who had survived countless dogfights, knew the war was lost in the skies. They respected their American counterparts, often describing them as fearless and relentless. Göring, however, grew increasingly delusional. He boasted that Germany would soon unleash a miracle weapon, the jet-powered Me-262. Though the jet was revolutionary, it arrived too late and in too few numbers to change the tide. American bombers destroyed the factories before they could produce enough to matter. The irony was cruel. Göring had mocked America's production power, yet it was production itself that now destroyed him. In late 1944, as the Allies advanced across France and into Belgium, the Luftwaffe launched one final desperate gamble, Operation Bodenplot, an air assault meant to cripple Allied air power on New Year's Day, 1945. It failed catastrophically. Hundreds of German planes were destroyed on the ground and in the air. The Luftwaffe ceased to exist as a strategic force. Göring, humiliated and bloated from excess, became a recluse within his palace at Carenhall. He no longer laughed. He no longer boasted. Reports of American bomber streams numbering over 1,000 aircraft broke his spirit. The empire he had promised to dominate the skies had become the empire of ashes below. The laughter that once filled his marble office in Berlin was replaced by the distant rumble of bombers, the same sound that had once echoed from the factories of thunder. The man who had mocked Roosevelt's 50,000-plane dream now lived under its shadow, literally and figuratively, as wave after wave of American aircraft carved his downfall across the sky. The Reich was crumbling, and the Luftwaffe, once the pride of Hermann Göring, was only a ghost of its former self. The same skies that had once thundered with the might of German aircraft now belonged entirely to the Allies. American bombers flew over the Reich in broad daylight without fear, while British bombers turned the nights into firestorms. The air superiority Göring had promised Hitler had become a fantasy whispered in the ruins of Berlin. Every airfield that once sent forth the eagles of Germany now lay buried under craters. The young pilots who remained, boys barely 18, faced an impossible choice: fly and die, or disobey orders and face execution. They climbed into their aircraft with trembling hands, engines sputtering on fumes, knowing that they were no longer hunters but prey. Above them, American P-51 Mustangs hunted with ruthless efficiency, diving from the sun and tearing through German formations before they even reached altitude. In the sky, death came silently and swiftly. The Luftwaffe had run out of everything: fuel, ammunition, trained men, and most of all, hope. Göring, the once flamboyant commander who strutted in silk uniforms, now sat slumped in his command chair, his medals dull under the flickering lights of his underground bunker. He received reports that broke his spirit further each day. Aircraft destroyed on the ground, pilots lost before they could even complete training, fuel reserves so low that only a handful of missions could be flown. The empire of air that had once dazzled the world was now suffocating under the weight of its own failures. Hitler's rage knew no limits. He accused Göring of betrayal, cowardice, and incompetence. The man who once had Hitler's absolute confidence was now seen as a liability. Göring's pleas that the Americans simply have endless planes fell on deaf ears. The Führer did not want excuses, he wanted miracles. But there were none left to give. The miracle had already happened, but it was American, not German. The factories of Detroit, Seattle, and Los Angeles did what no army could. They buried the Luftwaffe under sheer production. For every plane Germany built, America built 20. For every pilot Germany lost, America trained 30. It was not just war, it was arithmetic, and arithmetic was merciless. Göring's famous laugh, the same one that echoed through Berlin in 1940 when he dismissed Roosevelt's plan, was now a memory drowned by the endless hum of Allied bombers overhead. Even his aides noticed the change. The man who once spoke with grandeur now muttered to himself, staring at maps covered in red lines pushing closer to Berlin. His palaces were bombed, his art collections destroyed, his wealth meaningless. The Luftwaffe's jet fighters, once hailed as the miracle weapons that would save Germany, were grounded more often than they flew. There was no fuel to power them. Some pilots were ordered to tow gliders filled with explosives toward Allied columns, an act of pure desperation that symbolized the total collapse of rational command. Göring, who once ruled the skies, now ruled nothing but ruins. Meanwhile, in America, production reached its zenith. The final tally of aircraft built by the United States during World War II reached over 300,000. The figure was so enormous that it defied imagination. Factories that once made cars, radios, or sewing machines had turned into assembly lines for death. Bombers, fighters, transports, and reconnaissance planes rolled out day and night. Every 2 hours a new bomber took flight. Every 5 minutes a new fighter left the hangar. The industrial rhythm was relentless, mechanical, and precise. An orchestra of steel conducted by the will of a free people. Women, once confined to domestic roles, became the backbone of this miracle. Rosie the Riveter became an icon of strength. symbolizing millions of women who riveted metal, welded wings, and tested engines. The war was not just fought by soldiers, but by machinists, welders, and factory workers who believed that every bolt tightened brought victory closer. Their hands built the sky that buried the Reich. Every rivet was revenge for Pearl Harbor, every fuselage a promise that tyranny would not stand. In Europe, the tide had long turned. The Allies pushed from the west, while the Soviets crushed from the east. The skies above Germany swarmed with American planes, delivering destruction with mathematical precision. Bridges, railways, and factories disappeared under clouds of smoke and fire. By April 1945, Germany was bleeding from every vein, its supply lines severed, its army starving, its morale broken. The once proud Luftwaffe, which had paraded through the skies in victory during the early days of Blitzkrieg, was now hunted into extinction. Göring's last desperate act was to send a telegram to Hitler, suggesting that he, as second in command, should take over leadership since the Führer was trapped in Berlin. Hitler interpreted it as betrayal. Göring was stripped of his titles, arrested, and confined in a villa under SS guard. The Reichsmarshal who had once commanded the skies now found himself a prisoner of his own regime. The war ended shortly after, with Berlin reduced to rubble and the Nazi dream extinguished. Göring was captured by American forces in Bavaria, his once glorious uniform now a faded costume of a fallen empire. When American officers interrogated him, they showed him photographs, thousands of planes lined up across American airfields, stretching as far as the eye could see. Göring stared at them in silence, his lips trembling, eyes hollow. The man who had once mocked Roosevelt's plan of building 50,000 aircraft now sat in disbelief as he saw proof that America had built more than 100,000 and then some. His laughter was gone forever. What replaced it was something darker, the realization that he had been wrong not only about America, but about everything. His pride, his arrogance, his delusion, all shattered under the weight of American industry. The war had been fought not only by soldiers and generals, but by engineers, dreamers, and laborers who had turned imagination into dominance. Göring had laughed at a number, but that number had become his undoing. The skies that once carried his victory now carried his defeat. The ruins of Berlin were silent when the last bombers flew overhead. The Americans didn't need to drop anything anymore. There was nothing left to destroy. Germany was a scar on the earth, its cities flattened, its people exhausted, its leaders either dead or captured. Göring, during his trial at Nuremberg, tried to reclaim his old bravado. He argued that Germany had been betrayed, that he had only followed orders. But deep down, he knew. Every time he heard the name Boeing or Lockheed, he flinched. He remembered his laughter, his arrogance, his belief that America was soft. The truth was far harder than he could have imagined. America had forged its will into steel and wings, and those wings had ended his empire. Even as he faced judgment, the irony followed him. The man who mocked machines was destroyed by them. The post-war world looked to the skies with new eyes. Aviation had changed forever. The same industry that had created 100,000 warplanes now turned its genius toward peace, building airliners, cargo planes, and technologies that would unite rather than divide. But the memory of Göring's laughter lingered in history as a lesson written in smoke and fire. Never underestimate the resolve of a free nation. When the call came, America didn't build 50,000 planes, it built the future itself. The numbers that Göring once ridiculed had become a symbol of what determination and unity could achieve. His empire had vanished, but his mockery lived on only as a warning. Arrogance blinds even the mighty. The laughter of Hermann Göring was the laughter of a man who thought numbers couldn't win wars, but in the end, numbers, multiplied by courage and purpose, had written his epitaph. The echo of iron and sky. The war was over, but its echoes lingered across continents, carried by the ghosts of steel and smoke that had once filled the skies. Europe lay broken, its cities in ruins, its people rebuilding from the ashes of empire. And amid that devastation, the story of Hermann Göring's laughter became a legend whispered among soldiers and historians alike. The man who had once mocked Roosevelt's 50,000 plane plan had lived long enough to witness the unimaginable. An America that not only achieved that goal, but doubled it, reshaping the very idea of industrial warfare. Göring's arrogance had not merely underestimated an enemy, it had misjudged an entire civilization's potential. He had believed that comfort and consumerism made Americans weak, that a nation of shoppers and dreamers could not stand against the iron discipline of the Reich. But he had misunderstood the essence of freedom, that in a free land, innovation was not commanded by fear, but born from belief. While the Reich forced its people to labor for tyranny, America inspired its citizens to build for liberty. The assembly lines of democracy had proven stronger than the factories of fascism. Göring's downfall was not merely military, it was moral. The Reich's ideology was rigid, chained to dogma and hierarchy. America's system was fluid, adaptive, and fueled by imagination. For every obstacle, there was an invention. For every loss, a new design. The war that Göring thought would be won by pride was won instead by purpose. Even in his prison cell, Göring could not escape the sound of engines overhead, the Allied planes that still patrolled Europe, maintaining peace through the same skies that had once brought war. He would pace his cell, hands behind his back, haunted by the echo of his own words. America will never build 50,000 planes. The irony gnawed at him, deeper than any interrogation could. The laughter that once filled banquet halls in Berlin had become a ghostly echo bouncing through the ruins of his memory. He was a man crushed not by an enemy's weapon, but by his own disbelief. The Nuremberg trials became his final stage, and like a tragic actor, Göring tried to perform one last act of grandeur. He spoke eloquently, defiant even in defeat, trying to justify his crimes and reclaim some shadow of dignity. But behind that facade was the hollow reality of a man whose empire had fallen to the hum of American industry. The prosecutors showed films, endless reels of destruction, of American bombers in formation, of cities burning under the rain of precision. Each image was a reminder of his failure, of the mockery that had become his curse. When asked if he still believed America could not build 50,000 planes, Göring smirked faintly and said, "They built too many." It was his last honest sentence. Not long after, he took his own life in his cell, swallowing poison to escape the humiliation of the gallows. His death marked the end of an era, the final note in a symphony of arrogance undone by reality. Yet outside the courtroom, the world was already changing. The American war machine that had once built bombers now turned its factories toward peace. Airfields that had launched waves of B-17s and B-29s now sent forth civilian airliners, massive birds that carried not bombs, but people across oceans once torn by war. The same engineers who had designed weapons of destruction now built the engines of connection. Boeing, Lockheed, and Douglas became the architects of a new global age. Air travel was no longer a fantasy of the elite, it was becoming the heartbeat of the modern world. The Cold War loomed, of course, but even that confrontation would be shaped by the lessons learned from Göring's laughter. America had discovered that its greatest strength was not in weapons, but in willpower, in its ability to turn imagination into production. Factories that once made tanks now built tractors. Women who once riveted steel now studied engineering. Children who once collected scrap metal now dreamed of stars and spaceflight. The war had proven one eternal truth. Industry, when united by purpose, could move mountains or level them. The ruins of Germany stood as monuments to the cost of arrogance. Among the debris of the Third Reich, Allied soldiers found Göring's personal treasures, paintings, gold and jewels looted from across Europe. But they also found his personal diaries, filled with reflections of vanity, dreams of conquest, and disbelief that the Americans had achieved what they did. In one margin, scrawled faintly in pencil, was a note historians would later highlight. Perhaps they were not as soft as we thought. Those words, small and unguarded, were perhaps the only truth Göring ever admitted to himself. They were a quiet concession from a man who had mocked an entire nation into proving him wrong. The legacy of that laughter reached far beyond Göring's death. In every classroom, in every airfield, in every history book, his name became synonymous with hubris. The lesson of his mockery was taught not as a story of defeat, but as a warning. Never underestimate the resolve of those who fight not for domination, but for freedom. Roosevelt's quiet confidence, his calm belief that America could outbuild the enemy, became the foundation of a new doctrine: victory through unity. The war had been a test of machines, yes, but also of ideals. The Reich built under compulsion, America built under conviction. And conviction, when paired with technology and will, proved unstoppable. The sound that echoed across the Atlantic during those years, the roar of engines, the whistle of bombs, the symphony of steel, was more than a sound of war. It was the sound of a free people rising together, proving that laughter and arrogance could not stand against endurance and ingenuity. Years later, as veterans gathered at reunions and museums preserved the aircraft that once ruled the skies, old men would tell their grandchildren about the day Göring laughed. They would smile as they recounted how a dictator's arrogance became his downfall, and how a nation of ordinary workers, mothers, and engineers silenced that laughter forever. They would describe the sight of the American bomber streams, stretching from horizon to horizon, and how even the Germans below stood in awe of their scale. You couldn't count them, one veteran would say. You just looked up and knew you were seeing history. And so the story of Hermann Göring and the 50,000 planes passed into legend, not as a boast, but as a testament. It became a story about what humanity can achieve when pride meets perseverance, when doubt is met with determination. Göring's laughter faded, but its echo remained, a reminder written across the sky in contrails and courage. In the end, the numbers spoke louder than any words. 50,000 became 100,000, and from those wings rose not just victory, but a new world. The factories of war had become the engines of peace, and the sky that once burned with battle now shimmered with the promise of tomorrow. Hermann Göring had laughed at a dream. The world had answered with thunder.